Pagou 14 mil?
13.
13? No cash.
Foi.
Tá com muito aí.
Tava mesmo. Falou a palavra certinha. Tava.
Não, eu falei tá com muito.
Tava. O dia já foi mesmo. Eu tô vivendo de pagar as contas com o dinheiro que sobrou. Ainda o cara lá quer cobrar para fazer a transferência do meu irmão, R$ 34 mil.
O que é isso tudo?
4% do valor venal da casa. Sabe quanto é que a casa governo acha que custa? R$ 500 mil.
E tem que pagar, né, também?
Aqui, ó. Aí arrumei um advogado, um picareta lá, meu irmão arrumou, não sei o que, o cara queria cobrar 10 mil. Aí eu bati e liguei pro lembrei do Tassi, né? Tassi mexe com imobiliário. Aí, pô, vou te arrumar um advogado. Aí ela falou, não, eu faço uma parte, como 10. Já baixou.
Faz o quê?
10 mil. Aí meu irmão arrumou um cara lá que ele trabalha, eu acho que ele nem conhece, ele é PM, ele é advogado. Cobra 4 mil. Eu ia pagar 17, meu irmão 17, já caiu para 14. Pô, tá bom demais.
Mas 4 mil, não é 4 mil?
Vai do advogado, mas tem mais 20 mil, vai 24. Tem mais as taxas do cartório. É tudo caro, velho.
Caro, velho. O governo cobra de quem compra, cobra de quem vende, vende tudo quanto é lado, né?
Eu só do pai para comprar um lote, para construir uma casa. Agora o que eu vendi que é 20 mil reais no dinheiro do meu pai. Ah, se ferrar, velho.
Não, tá dando pau aqui. Tô pegando o seu áudio.
Mas é pra pegar?
Hã?
É pra pegar?
Não, era pra pegar o áudio da caixa. Tá pegando o áudio ambiente.
Sabe nem também.
Sim.
Ô, me passa o localizador, beleza? Tá. Vou lá depois. Collaborative actions between professional and communities, particularly indigenous ones. This requires an understanding of indigenous cosmologies regarding health and the valuing of their mother tongue. For example, the inclusion of indigenous community health agents. Also strengthens the relationships of trust and the active participation of users in managing their own health. Another concept of significance is that florestania. How can I translate it? It's similar to the citizenship from and of the forest. Forestania posits a balanced relationship between the lifestyles of indigenous people and the natural resources of the forest. These concepts force a sustainable perception essential for both the preservation of natural environments and the maintenance of traditional way of life in the Amazon region, Brazilian Amazon region, which at times extended into urban areas. In context where urban and indigenous populations coexist and interact, florestania emerge as an invitation to incorporate sustainable practices into daily life, reinforcing the need for public policies that preserve intrinsically linked to the culture and beliefs of each group, offers a unique perspective on care and prevention that can enrich conventional biomedical models. The integration of indigenous knowledge into a health practice not only recognizes the values autochthonous cultures, but also contributes to the constructions of health systems that are more resilient and adapted to diversity. In the end, I promise. Um, in summary, the analysis of intersectoral and pro-equity actions in primary health care, in light of the realities of vulnerable urban indigenous people, reveals historical challenges and opportunity for constructing a more inclusive health system. The incorporation of precepts of integrality, florestania, and indigenous medicine into care process that use the health system, for example. So that's all. I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute this debate and express my hope that collective we can advance in building health system that integrate and respect the plurality of knowledges and practices, thereby strengthening the principles of universality and equity to access to health. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Very, a lot of things to think about it. I think about Chinese medicine also, that we try to incorporate, why not incorporate our traditional knowledge? I think is a good discussion. And now I will call our speakers to react to the three comments. And first,
just want to say, I think Rodrigo, Jerry, and Kerry have all shared some very thought-provoking reflections that I will respond to. But before that, I just wanted to comment on how interesting it was listening to Niki and to Fabiana, because I think there are some really strong themes cutting across, as Kerry's identified, and also Jerry. So I think I was particularly struck by the emphasis on learning that was in both Niki and Fabiana's presentations. And I think that is something for the Brazilian indigenous health subsystem in its 25th year to consider. It's like, where is the learning? Where is the institutionalization of that iterative learning process? Because actually, 25 years is enough time to have learned. And there is learning. It's just, I'm not convinced that learning is being taken on board by policymakers, partly to do with churn at the top as well as at the front line. So I think we should use this opportunity, the 25th anniversary of the establishment of the first indigenous health districts in 2000, to call for reflection and learning on the trajectory of the system. And also I thought it was quite telling that we were all emphasizing the importance of social participation across sectoral and intersectoral programming. But yeah, I just wanted to thank the discussants for some really stimulating reflections. I guess I'll almost neighbors. I mean, the Amazon's very big. I was working in Songabela Cachoeira, you're working in Manaus. That's like 1,000 kilometers apart, but it's still in the same state. But yes, I really appreciate that you found in your own work with urban indigenous communities the same emphasis on intercultural working as central to effective primary healthcare. So I think that's very telling, and that's part of a broader reflection about how health systems can adapt to cultural heterogeneity in hyper-diverse settings like Toronto, right? Gary, you're in like one of the most diverse cities on the planet, as well as in kind of remote and marginal territories like the Brazilian Amazon. So I think that emphasis on working interculturally is a really valuable body of thought and reflection and practice from Brazil and Latin America more broadly. There's a lot of really interesting work on intercultural working in Peru and Colombia as well. And I think that's valuable to those of us working in the UK. And Jerry mentioned a project in Brighton on learning from the response to the pandemic, which is our local city here in England, and which he and I have worked together on. And I think that the need for intercultural practice and intercultural policy in responding to health inequities affecting Black and racially minoritized communities came out very strongly from that as well. Florestania, I'm less sure about, and that's because I worked in Acre with the Workers' Party governments who implemented Florestania. And I was very struck. I was back in Acre last year. Acre is a small state in the southwest of Brazilian Amazonia, for those who are not familiar with it. And it was a real hotbed of innovation in terms of thinking and practice around working interculturally in health and in other fields in the 2000s, which is when I was working there in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I'm struck by the fact that Acre was the state in the Brazilian Amazon that voted most strongly for Bolsonaro in the last elections. So there is a lesson there about, as Jerry says, it's a problem of implementation. You had a state government that espoused the principle of Florestania very strongly, that tried to implement it, but for many reasons, I would submit that one of the reasons is a failure to engage systematically with centralized thinking and bureaucratic rigidities and how they disable trust building and responsiveness building. They ultimately failed to convince the population that Florestania or forest citizenship was the way forward. And they lost the elections. The Workers' Party is out of power for 20 years, and it's a very Bolsonaro state now. Okay. There are many factors to do with economic change, social change, but I think advocates of Florestania have to answer the question of why it didn't gain more long-standing popular legitimacy. But I love the concept. I was amazed, when I first came across it, it inspired me, and it inspired a lot of the practice with which I was involved. But I think there are serious questions about how we sustain that approach in the current political and social context. So much to think about. And I'll move on to Jerry. So yes, Jerry, implementation. And yes, of course, what we've been learning together in the pandemic shows that it is possible. So I think we should learn from what can be done in the same way that the Brazilian indigenous health subsystem went through a massive innovative phase with extraordinarily impressive development of new approaches. In the early 2000s, that was then shut down in the process of bureaucratization. So I think we need constantly to unlearn and relearn. And I think what we're seeing in the UK with the reimposition of austerity, the reimposition of top-down thinking after a period of very rapid learning in response to the pandemic is symptomatic of the way that this reversion to norms which are hostile to decentralization, trust building and responsiveness at the local level is the systemic problem. And I think, Kerry, you've really called it out as a systemic problem, so thank you for that. But I think also where you call our attention to sovereignty as an issue, and I think when I hear the indigenous movement in Brazil calling for autonomy of the health districts, that's a sovereigntist appeal. It's saying we want to govern our own health because our own health is everything. So they are fundamentally intersectoral in how they think about health. They don't separate health from land. They don't separate health from spirituality. They don't separate health from food. They don't separate health, crucially, from social relations and balanced ways of being together in the world with human and non-human animals and spirits. So I think that relationality, and I've read, so for instance, Wildcat, Canadian indigenous scholar of political theory, talks a lot about relational governance, which I think is a very inspiring way for us to learn from indigenous peoples about how we need to change the governance of health systems in the direction of sovereignty in dialogue. So we're not talking about absolute sovereignty. Jerry called our attention to this. You can't have everyone doing whatever they want. There is an evidence base on what works and what doesn't, and there is a need for norms and standards across health systems. But relationality calls for us to govern our health systems in a responsive and inclusive way in which that is in dialogue with other ways of being and knowing, and that dialogue is respectful, and it is two-way. So I think we need to move towards some kind of relational sovereignty in the governance of health systems would be my maybe utopian suggestion. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Alex. Please, Professor Nees, can you please now answer some of questions raised by the discussants?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rodrigo, Fabiana, Kerry, Jerry, Alex, extremely deep, rich reflections and lots of, food for thought. I think, resonate with a lot of it. And it's interesting actually about how many of these concepts actually are applicable across contexts. And I do agree with what Jerry was saying. It's not really about low and middle income countries or different context in some ways. Some of these underlying core systemic issues really, and also ways of working, I suppose, actually do sort of encompass across contexts. And the other thing, and Kerry mentioned a little bit about that, about how, if you ask people, they wouldn't necessarily pick the problems that maybe the evidence identifies as problems that need to be solved. And partly, the way that I came to this work, starting from a health systems lens to actually looking at policies outside of the health sector, was to say, okay, let's move away from sort of populations and then say, how can we solve the problems of the bottom or the indigenous populations or the poor or so on, and to say, what are the problems and who is it most applicable for? And that's partly what got us to looking at these kinds of policies, to say, okay, then first let's start with what the issues are and think about equity also in a slightly different way, in terms of looking at actually problems that are more urgent across particular populations, and then how can we build consensus around broad-based consensus across society, rather than thinking of it as how can we solve the problem of indigenous populations or rural populations or whoever, particular populations group. And for that to be sort of standalone and for systems to be built around just that. Because to Jerry's point about implementation, what enables effective implementation actually is a sort of this consensus and political will, it seems, across the system. Because after all, our policy structures are really not necessarily, decentralized. To some extent they are, but not necessarily, cannot necessarily adapt in such a, geographic or population kind of a way. The policies are more universal, to go back to that original word. So I think this idea of interculturality actually is this new thing that's going to be stuck in my mind for a while, because there's so many different nuances, I think, to it. And this is again something that, again, reflecting back on our own sort of role as health and what constitutes evidence, what constitutes effective policy actions, and to be able to say, separate not the starting point for it cannot be the solutions or the sectoral evidence that we generate, but actually the lived experience of people. And this tension a little bit about how do we govern the need for decentralized implementation that can actually respond to community input, to the lived experience, but at the same time be able to build a sort of normative or value-based consensus around some of these issues, that these are issues that we all care about, which then has to be reflected in these sort of policy structures, right? And that's potentially the tension that I think can only be really overcome if we begin to think about some anecdotal evidence actually from India, where other frontline workers outside of the health sector, when those are working well, schemes in other sectors, then it also tends to make the health frontline workers be more effective. And it's an open, it's an open question whether the context, the institutional, organizational, policy this whole idea of sort of communication and harmonization, and whether it should be based on evidence or it should be based on inputs, and this idea of having
One
diverse
minute.
evidence.
1 minute.
Sure. This idea of relational governance, which actually encompasses people as well, and how do we once again think about policy implementation, really, which doesn't only think about the administrators or the frontline workers, but actually also thinks about the people as part of that implementation machinery, if you will. And that's again something that's potentially applicable across contexts and across sectors. So thank you, Fabiana. Over to you.
Thank you, thank you. I'll just give some brief comments. Yes, Carrie, the question of responsiveness and continuing communication between the community, the frontliners is essential. It has to be bottom up, upper bottom. And we know that from theories and from field case, and it's very challenging indeed, and too important. And yes, Jerry, it takes a long time so that you have a. But one thing about the UK NHS is that now you have together the Ministry of Health and Social Care. So it's much easier to build, but institutionally they're together, although they might have some divergences. So it's much easier to build